He came for her land before the snow even melted. Marshal Caleb Voss rode into the valley on a gray horse with 6 deputies behind him and a piece of paper he called a legal order. He nailed it to the door of the Rowan family bakery while Eliza's mother was still inside, still breathing, still warm from fever. He didn't knock. He didn't wait. He told the deputy to post the eviction notice, and he turned his horse around without looking back, like the building was already empty, like the woman dying inside it was already gone. Eliza watched from across the street, flowers still on her hands. The paper flapped in the cold wind. She was 26 years old, and she had nothing left. If you've ever been told you're not enough, not pretty enough, not small enough, not the kind of woman anyone would choose, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow Eliza's journey all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. You will not want to miss what happens next. The morning they posted the bride notices in Caldwell, Montana, Eliza Rowan had been in town for 11 days and had already been looked past by 4 different men. It wasn't subtle. None of it was subtle. The men would come down the line of women standing outside the territorial office. Some arrangement the land company and the local ranchers had put together, practical as buying seed corn. And they would walk slowly, nodding at this one, pausing at that one, and then their eyes would reach Eliza and move on without stopping, like she was a fence post, like she was furniture, like she was the space between 2 things that mattered. She was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. Back in Pennsylvania, before everything collapsed, she had been the baker's daughter and then the baker herself. And she had arms that could knead dough for 6 hours without stopping, and a laugh that carried across a room and a way of looking at a problem until she found the angle that made it solvable. She had never thought of herself as beautiful, exactly, but she had thought of herself as useful, as capable, as someone worth knowing. Montana had not agreed with that assessment. She stood in line wearing her brown wool dress, the best one she owned, the one her mother had hemmed before she got too sick to sit up straight. She had her hair pinned. She had washed her face and her hands twice. She had done everything she could think to do, and it hadn't mattered, because the men looked at Caroline Fitch's golden curls and Ruth Alderman's small waist, and they didn't see Eliza at all. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, who ran the rooming house where the prospective bride stayed, had told her on the second day not to get her hopes up. "The men out here want a woman who can keep up, Mrs." Crane had said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "They look for certain things." "I can keep up," Eliza had said. Mrs. Crane had smiled the smile of someone who has stopped bothering to argue. "I'm sure you can, dear." That conversation sat in Eliza's chest like a swallowed stone. She thought about it every morning when she got up and put on the brown dress and went and stood in line and waited to be ignored. She thought about it on the 12th day too, which was the day everything changed. The morning had started the same as all the others. Cold enough to see your breath. The mountains north of town were lost in low gray cloud, just dark shapes pressing against the sky. 7 women stood in a loose line outside the territorial office. Caroline Fitch had worn her blue dress again, the one that made her eyes look like creek water in summer. Ruth Alderman had done something new with her hair. Eliza had worn the brown dress because it was the only one she had. 3 men had come and gone by 10 in the morning. One had taken Caroline's hand and walked her to the land office to start the paperwork before Eliza had even finished counting the buttons on her cuff. She was not envious exactly, or maybe she was, a little. She was tired, and there is a kind of envy that lives right next to exhaustion, that you can barely tell apart from it. She was looking at her shoes when she heard the sound. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift in the way the other women were breathing, a collective intake. She looked up. The man walking toward them from the far end of the street was not like the ranchers and the homesteaders who had come before. Those men had been practical men mostly, men who needed a wife the way they needed a good mule, for the work, for the long winters, with varying degrees of apology for that fact. They had come in clean shirts and had tried to make decent impressions. This man had not tried to make a decent impression. He was enormous. Not fat, but big, the way a mountain is big, like something the land had made rather than something born of a woman. He wore a trapper's coat that had seen years of hard use, dark with old water stains and the kind of grime that doesn't come out no matter how long you scrub. His boots were caked with mud from the trail. He hadn't shaved in a week, maybe 2. And his face, the left side of his face carried a scar that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw, white and jagged, the kind of mark that told a story you probably didn't want to hear the full version of. He walked like he was used to moving through terrain that pushed back against him, like the ground itself was something to be negotiated with. Several of the women took a small step back without seeming to notice they were doing it. Eliza stood still. She didn't know why. Maybe she was too tired to step back. Maybe something in her had stopped having the energy for the kind of fear that was mostly about appearances. She stood still, and she watched the man walk toward them, and she thought, without any particular drama, that he looked like someone who had been through worse things than she had and had come out the other side still walking. She thought there was something to be said for that. His name, she learned later, was Brennan Holt. She didn't know it then. She just knew he was walking down the line of women the same way the others had, looking, and her stomach clenched the way it always did because she already knew how this part went. She had learned the pattern. He would look at Caroline, he would look at Ruth, his eyes would cross her face without landing, and she would go back to staring at her shoes. He stopped in front of Caroline first. Caroline smiled. The kind of smile she had clearly practiced, warm and a little uncertain, exactly the right amount of modest. The man looked at her for a moment. His expression didn't change. He moved on. Ruth Alderman lifted her chin slightly. He paused, looked, kept walking. Two more women. He glanced at each. Moved on. Eliza had started looking at her shoes again. She heard his boots on the frozen ground, getting closer, and she thought, here it comes. Here's the part where I become invisible again. And she was so braced for it that when the boots stopped in front of her, she thought for a moment she was imagining it. She looked up. He was looking at her, really looking, not the quick scan the others had given her before moving on. He was looking at her the way you look at something you're actually thinking about, the way you look at a problem you're trying to solve or a piece of ground you're considering crossing. His eyes were gray-brown, the color of weathered wood. The scar on his cheek was more prominent up close. There was a small nick above his left eyebrow that she hadn't noticed from a distance. He said, "You're Eliza Rowan." It wasn't a question. Someone must have told him, or maybe he'd read the name boards. "I am," she said. He nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You worked a bakery back east." "Owned it," she said, and she didn't know why she corrected him except that it seemed important not to be smaller than she actually was. Not now, not in front of this man who was looking at her like she was real. "After my father died, I ran it for 4 years." "In what city?" "Pittsburgh. Then after some things happened, I was in Lancaster." He looked at her hands. She resisted the urge to hide them. They were working hands, rough at the knuckles. The skin on her right palm thickened from the oven handle. "Can you shoot?" he asked. She blinked. None of the other men had asked that. "No," she said, "but I can learn." Something moved in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the absence of something that had been there before. "Can you handle cold?" he asked. "Not cold like this. Cold that comes down off the mountain and gets into the floor and stays there for months. Cold that kills you if you're not paying attention." "I don't know," she said. "I've never been tested like that." "At least you didn't lie," he said. He stood there a moment longer. Behind her, Eliza could feel the other women watching. She could feel Mrs. Crane watching from the doorway of the land office, 20 feet away. She could feel the weight of being looked at, which was different from the weight of being ignored. Both were heavy. They were just heavy in different ways. "I'm Brennan Holt," he said. "I have a cabin up in the high country, north of the Blackfoot Range. 7 months of winter, sometimes 8. 140 miles from the nearest town with a doctor. I need someone who can hold up in isolation, who can do physical work, and who won't fall apart when things go wrong. I've got a problem coming that I can't explain to you in detail right now, but I want you to know it's there." Eliza stared at him. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that has a name and a badge and isn't done making trouble." She absorbed that, the rational part of her brain, the part that had managed a business and kept accounts and made decisions about flour prices and delivery schedules, was sending up something that felt very much like an alarm. The other part of her, the part that had watched her mother die in a room that a corrupt marshal had tried to take from them, the part that had stood in this line for 12 days being overlooked and dismissed, that part was very, very quiet. "You didn't choose any of those other women," she said. "No." Caroline Fitch is prettier than me. Ruth Alderman is half my size. I know. So why me? He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said flatly, without cruelty, but without any particular softness either, because you're built to last. Because you corrected me when I got something wrong, and you didn't apologize for it. Because when I walked up to you, you didn't flinch. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months, possibly longer. It also stung because it wasn't about her face or her laugh or any of the things she'd half hoped, somewhere under all the practicality, might matter to someone someday. It was about her usefulness. It was about what she could survive. She thought about her mother, about the bakery, about the eviction notice flapping in the cold wind while the marshal rode away without looking back. I'll need to know more about this problem, she said. You will, he said. Not today. And I'll need my own terms. His eyes narrowed just slightly. Not with anger, with interest. Go ahead. I don't want to be managed. If there's danger, I want to know what it is. If there's a plan, I want to be part of making it. I'm not looking to be kept safe in a corner while someone else handles the world. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that might be the most complicated thing I've heard all week. I'm not complicated, she said. I'm just not willing to be less than I am to make things easier for someone else. He looked at her hands again. He looked at her face. He said, All right, Eliza Rowan, we have a deal. And that was how it started. The paperwork took most of the afternoon. The justice of the peace was a small, dry man named Aldous who smelled like pipe tobacco and seemed faintly embarrassed by all of it, which Eliza supposed was appropriate since the whole arrangement was, when you looked at it honestly, fairly embarrassing. She and Brennan Holt signed their names on a document that made them legally married before they had spent more than 45 minutes in the same space. She found herself watching his handwriting. He wrote carefully, deliberately, the letters even, and controlled, nothing wasted. And thinking about what that told her about him, and then catching herself doing it and feeling foolish. They were legally strangers who happened to be married. She needed to stop making meaning out of his penmanship. Mrs. Crane pulled her aside while Brennan was settling something with the land office clerk. You don't have to do this, she said quietly, and for a moment Eliza felt something ease in her chest, because at least someone was saying it. There are other options. You could wait. For what? Eliza asked. Mrs. Crane didn't have an answer for that. He's not unkind, Eliza said, because that was what she'd decided. She didn't know it yet for certain, but she'd been watching people her whole life, watching customers, watching suppliers, watching her father negotiate and her mother manage the difficult ones. And she had learned to read the shape of a person in the small things. The way Brennan had been honest with her, even when the honesty was not flattering. The way he'd listened when she spoke. The way he hadn't laughed. He's dangerous, Mrs. Crane said. I know, Eliza said. He told me. She went back to where Brennan was waiting. They left Caldwell before sunset. He had a wagon, old, serviceable, the boards replaced in patches that didn't quite match the original wood, loaded with provisions he'd already purchased and secured under oilskin. He helped her up without ceremony, checked the load, checked the horses, climbed up beside her, and started driving. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Eliza was not someone who was afraid of silence. She had spent a lot of time alone in the years after her father died, working in the bakery before anyone else was awake, the city quiet outside and the ovens ticking as they warmed. She had learned that silence wasn't the same as emptiness. Sometimes it was just two things existing without needing to explain themselves to each other. But she was also paying close attention to everything, because she was a practical woman, and she was now heading into territory. She didn't know with a man she had met 4 hours ago, and information felt important. The road north out of Caldwell crossed two creek beds, both running low in the late autumn cold. The trees thinned as they climbed. The mountains ahead didn't get closer the way she expected. They just got bigger, the way mountains do, until they were less like a picture and more like a wall. Where exactly are we going? She asked finally. Another day and a half at this pace, he said. We'll stop tonight before the first real climb. There's a place I use when I'm moving goods down to sell. How long have you been up there, on the mountain? 7 years. She absorbed that. 7 years alone, or near enough to alone, in a place a day and a half away from the nearest town. She tried to imagine it, and found she couldn't quite. She was a person who had always been surrounded by people, customers, neighbors, her parents, the constant noise and movement of a city. 7 years in the quiet. She didn't know what that did to a person. "You weren't married before?" she asked. He glanced sideways at her. "No." "Have you ever—" She stopped. It was not her business, except that it was now, arguably, absolutely her business. "Have you ever wanted to be?" A long pause. "Not before I needed to be. And now you need to be." "Yes." She turned that over in her mind. "Because of the problem you mentioned." "Partly." "What's the other part?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "A man alone up there for long enough starts wondering about the point of it. The work. The trapping. What it's all for." She hadn't expected that. She'd expected practical reasons, all the way down. She hadn't expected him to say something that honest, that undefended. She looked at the mountains. "I understand that," she said. "I ran a bakery for 4 years after my father died. Made bread every morning, sold it, did it again. And at some point I started asking what I was making it for." He didn't say anything, but she had the sense he was listening. "My mother got sick," she said. "I was dealing with that, and the bakery, and then some financial things went wrong. A loan I'd taken, and the man who held it was connected to people who wanted the property for other reasons. And it all fell apart faster than I could stop it." She paused. She didn't want to say Caleb Voss's name. She didn't even have a name to say. Not then. She just had the image of the gray horse and the eviction notice and the paper flapping in the cold. "I came out here because there was nothing left to stay for." "How long ago?" "My mother died in September. I was in Caldwell by October." He nodded, a single slow movement. "I'm sorry." "She would have found this very strange," Eliza said. She almost laughed, and then didn't because the almost laugh turned into something else in her throat. "Me, going to Montana. She always thought I'd end up running a restaurant someday. Something bigger than the bakery." "Maybe you still will." She looked at him. He was watching the road, his hands steady on the reins, his face in profile. She thought about what it would mean to find that funny, and decided she didn't have the energy yet. "Maybe," she said. They stopped when the light failed, at a hollow between two ridges where the wind dropped off, and a fire circle of stones suggested other travelers had used the spot before. He built the fire without drama, efficiently, the kind of efficiency that came from doing something thousands of times. She set about unpacking the cooking things from the wagon, found salt pork and dried beans in a small pot, and had something going before he'd finished with the horses. He sat across the fire from her and watched her work. "You're fast," he said. "I've been cooking since I was 8, she said. "Speed gets trained into you." "I wasn't trying to compliment you, I was just observing." "I know," she said. I took it as a compliment anyway. I do that sometimes. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the muscle movement that a smile might start from. She catalogued it and kept stirring. They ate without ceremony. The food wasn't good. There was no way for it to be good, dried beans and salt pork cooked in 20 minutes over a campfire. But it was hot, and hot mattered when the temperature was dropping fast, and the ground was giving up the last of its stored warmth. She watched him eat without watching him, the sideways observation she'd learned from years of a bakery counter, where you couldn't stare at customers but you needed to read them. He ate deliberately. He didn't waste anything. He tipped the pot to get the last of the liquid. He didn't say it was good or bad. When they were done, he said, "I'm going to tell you some of what you need to know." She set down her cup. "All right." "The man I mentioned, the one with the badge." He stopped. Reorganized something in his expression. "His name is Caleb Voss. He's been the territorial marshal for this district for 9 years. He runs cattle on land he doesn't own through a syndicate of men who use his badge to keep anyone from asking questions. There are 5 ranchers in the valley below my mountain who have been pushed off their land in the last 3 years. 2 of them are dead. The official record says one was an accident and one was a wanted man who died resisting arrest." Eliza was very still. "Were they?" "No." She thought about the gray horse. The eviction notice. The way a man with authority can make something monstrous look like paperwork. "And you?" she said. "Why haven't they moved on you?" "Because I have something they want intact," he said. "The water. The mountain I'm on sits at the head of the main tributary that feeds the valley. The water rights have been in my family since my grandfather settled the land. Without my signature on a transfer, those rights can't move. And Caleb Voss has been working for 3 years to get to a point where he can take them. He's been patient, she said. He killed my brother 2 years ago, Brennan said. His voice didn't change when he said it. It was the same steady register as everything else. But his hand, resting on his knee, closed slowly into a fist and then opened again. Made it look like he'd been caught poaching on syndicate land. Jesse was up there checking our trap lines. He'd been doing it since he was 14 years old. The fire cracked. Something shifted in the wood and a spray of sparks went up and died. Eliza didn't say she was sorry. She thought he'd heard enough of that from enough people and that it had stopped meaning anything. She said, "So Voss killed your brother, and he's been trying to take your water rights, and he hasn't managed it yet because you've been out of his reach on the mountain." "Yes. But he knows you'll have to come down eventually, and now you've come down and married a woman and you're going back up." "Yes." "Which means he's going to come for us," she said. The fist opened and closed again. "Yes." She looked into the fire for a while. The flames had settled into something steadier, orange-red at the base, yellow at the tips. She thought about fear, which was a practical emotion when you used it right, when you let it sharpen your attention rather than lock up your legs. She thought about her mother, who had been afraid in the end but had never let it make her stupid. "You should have told me this before we signed the papers," she said. "You're right," he said. And then, after a beat, "Would it have changed your answer?" She thought about the 12 days, the brown dress, the eyes moving past her, the thing Mrs. Crane had said about what men look for. "No," she said. "But you should have told me." "Yes," he said. "I should have." They sat with that for a while. Then she said, "I want a gun. I'll teach you to shoot before the snow gets bad. I want to be good at it, not passable. Good." He looked at her across the fire. The scar on his cheek caught the light on one side and went dark on the other. "That takes time," he said. "Then we'd better start early," she said. He nodded. Once. The same nod as before, the one that meant something had been agreed to. She cleaned the pot and packed it back in the wagon. He banked the fire. They slept on opposite sides of it, wrapped in their own blankets, the horses shifting and breathing softly in the dark. The mountains were black shapes against a sky that was very clear and very cold, and full of more stars than she had ever seen in her life. She lay on her back and looked at them for a long time. She thought about Caleb Voss, who had ridden away from her mother's house without looking back. She thought about Brennan Holt, who had looked at her hands and chosen her on purpose. She thought about what it meant to be chosen for endurance rather than beauty, and whether that was an insult or a different kind of recognition entirely. She thought about what her mother would say. Her mother would say, "You'd better learn to shoot." She closed her eyes. Around her, the mountain wind moved through the high pines, cold and steady and indifferent to everything that mattered to her. She breathed it in. She let it out. She thought, "All right. All right then." She was still awake when the coyotes started calling in the dark, far up the ridge, and she listened to them and did not feel afraid of them, and eventually she slept. The second day of travel was harder. The road became a trail, and the trail became something that was more an idea about where to go than an actual path. The horses worked. The wagon creaked and lurched over frozen ground and through creek crossings that sent icy water spraying up over the floorboards. Eliza braced with her feet and kept her hands on the side rail and didn't complain, because complaining would not have helped anything, and she was not in the habit of doing things that didn't help. Brennan drove without talking much. She had begun to understand that this was his natural state, not coldness but compression, as if words were something rationed. She found she didn't mind it. She had known talkers, men who filled silence because silence made them nervous, and the words were always about themselves, always circling back to their own centers. Brennan's silences felt different. They felt like a man who was paying attention to something outside himself. Around midday, they stopped at a creek to water the horses. He handed her jerky from his coat pocket without ceremony, and she ate it standing up, looking at the water moving over the stones. The creek ran fast and clear, even in the cold, and she could see the bottom, could see individual pebbles, could see a place where something had disturbed the gravel bed and left a dark depression. "Is this the water?" she asked. "The water you mentioned." He looked at where she was looking. "Tributary," he said. "Feeds down to the main branch, which feeds the valley." She looked at the creek for a while longer. It wasn't much to look at. cold water running over cold rocks. But she thought about how things that look small can make everything else possible. She thought about bread, which was also just a few ordinary things combined in the right way. Is there anything I can do legally? She asked. About Voss, before he comes. I've tried, he said. 3 years of trying. The federal circuit judge is in his pocket. The land company that recorded the water rights has been bought by the syndicate. Getting a message out and waiting for response means months, and Voss will move before that. So we defend what we have. He agreed. And you think I can help do that? He looked at her directly. I think you might be better at it than you know, he said. Most people, when they hear the kind of thing I told you last night, they either freeze or they start making speeches about finding another way. You did neither. She thought about that. What did I do? You said you wanted a gun, he said. She almost smiled. I suppose I did. He turned back to the horses. Let's keep moving. The cabin appeared in late afternoon when the light had gone flat and gold and the shadows had started stretching long across the ground. It sat in a cleared space on the mountain's southern face, backed against a granite outcrop that cut the worst of the north wind. It was not a pretty cabin. It was not meant to be. It was low and solid, the logs heavy and close-fitted, with a stone chimney and shuttered windows and a door with 3 different kinds of hardware on it, as if someone had added latches the way other people added worries, one at a time as each new need presented itself. She looked at it for a moment from the wagon. I know it's not, he started. It's solid, she said. That's what matters up here. He was quiet a beat. Yes. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for him to help, and she walked up to the door, and she put her hand on the wood. It was cold, the way things that have been empty for a while are cold, a different cold than just temperature, a cold that's also silence. She thought about what it would take to make it something other than empty. She was very good at making things from scratch. She had been doing it her whole life. She pushed the door open and went inside. The first thing Eliza did inside the cabin was find the source of the smell. It wasn't a bad smell exactly, but it was a lived-in smell. Old smoke, cured hide, the particular mustiness of a space that had been closed up against cold for long stretches and never quite aired out properly. She stood just inside the door and let her eyes adjust and cataloged the room the way she used to catalog a new kitchen. What was there, what was missing, what could be fixed with work, and what would need something she didn't have yet. The main room was one large space with a stone fireplace taking up most of the north wall. A rough table, 2 chairs, both solid but unmatched, like he'd built them at different times without caring whether they went together. A set of shelves along the east wall holding tin cans, tools, a coil of rope, 2 lanterns, a collection of traps hung from pegs in graduated sizes. A sleeping area partitioned off by a heavy curtain hung from a cord, not a wall, just a curtain, and she noted that without comment and moved on. The floor was packed earth covered in places by hides. The window shutters were closed and latched. The hearth had ash in it from the last fire he'd made before coming down to Caldwell, and she could see from the depth of it that he'd been burning good hardwood, not pine. She opened the shutters on the south-facing window. Light came in. Brennan appeared in the doorway behind her, carrying 2 packs from the wagon. He stopped when he saw the shutter open. Cold'll come in, he said. Light's more important right now, she said. I need to see what I'm working with. He set the packs down and didn't argue. What she was working with, she found over the next 2 hours, was a space that functioned but didn't breathe. Everything had a practical purpose, and nothing had been arranged with any thought beyond that purpose. The supplies were organized well enough. He was clearly a man who knew where his things were, but the organization was the organization of a man who lived alone and had stopped noticing the edges. Grime in the corners, a cast iron pan with a handle that had been repaired with wire and needed a proper fix, a water barrel that was a third empty and had a crack developing near the base that would be a disaster once the freeze got serious. She found the crack by running her hand along the wood in the dim corner where the barrel sat, feeling for the seam of it. She stood up and said, "Your water barrel's cracking." He was at the table cleaning a rifle she hadn't seen him carry in. "I know," he said. "Have you got resin? Pine pitch?" In the small box on the bottom shelf, brown lid. She found it. She dealt with the crack then and there, pressing the pitch in with her thumb working it into the seam. Her thumb would smell like pine for days. She didn't mind. While the pitch was setting, she started on the fireplace. The ash needed clearing, the flue needed checking. She found the damper stuck half closed and worked it open and got a proper draft going before she laid the fire, which meant that when she lit it, the smoke went up instead of into the room, and the heat spread clean and fast. Brennan looked up from the rifle when he felt the warmth change. "You know fireplaces," he said. "I know ovens," she said. "Close enough." He went back to the rifle. She didn't try to talk to him. She kept working. She found a broom made from bundled twigs behind the door and went at the corners, the dust, the grime that had accumulated in the places a man living alone doesn't notice because he's stopped seeing them. She wasn't trying to make the place beautiful. She was trying to make it livable, which was a different thing and a more important one. By the time dark came fully down and the temperature outside dropped to something that pressed against the window like a hand, the cabin was warm and swept and smelled like fire and pine pitch instead of old smoke and hide. She had found potatoes in a root cellar accessed by a trapdoor in the floor, more than she'd expected, which told her he was a careful man about provisions. And she had them going in the pot with some dried herbs from a tied bundle on the shelf. She sat down at the table across from him. He had finished with the rifle and was going through something in a tin box he'd brought in from the wagon, papers of some kind, though she couldn't see what. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The water rights, the documents, where are they?" He looked up. His expression was careful, not suspicious but considered, as if he was deciding something. After a moment he reached into the tin box and took out a folded document and slid it across the table to her. She opened it. It was a land grant, the original. The paper gone brown at the edges and soft at the folds, the territorial seal pressed into the lower corner. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the ink faded to brown. The signature at the bottom was a different Holt. Grandfather, she guessed, from the date 1841. She read it carefully. Then she turned it over, looking for endorsements, notations, anything added later. "There's a second document," he said, "a water registry. Filed in 1863 when the territorial government started requiring formal registration." He found it in the box and put it beside the first. The original and the registry together establish clear title. Without both, the claim is contestable. With both, he paused. With both, it's harder for Voss to move on. She looked at the two documents side by side. Harder, but not impossible. No, not impossible. What's his play then, if he can't legally take them? He was quiet a moment. If I'm dead without heirs, the claim goes to dispute. Long enough dispute, the syndicate can move in under a temporary usage license. She absorbed that. And now you have a wife. Doesn't change things much, he said. Not unless the marriage is recorded and the wife knows what she holds. She looked at him across the table. Which is why you're telling me this. Yes. She looked back at the documents. Two pieces of old paper, brown and soft and nearly falling apart at the folds. She thought about how much weight a piece of paper could carry. The eviction notice on her mother's door, the loan papers the man had put in front of her in Lancaster, and now these, the documents that had made Brennan's brother a target and had put a marshal and a cattle syndicate at the end of every season he survived. "Where do you keep them?" she asked. "Hidden," he said. "Show me." Another pause. Longer. She waited without pressing, because she had learned in 2 days that Brennan Holt was a man who moved on his own time, and that pushing moved him slower, not faster. He got up from the table and went to the fireplace. He crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into a gap between the hearthstones, third from the bottom on the right side. The stone shifted, just slightly, pivoting on a hidden edge. Behind it was a hollow space, not big, roughly the size of the tin box, lined with oilskin. He put the documents in. He pressed the stone back. The gap disappeared. He looked at her. "Now you know," he said. "Now I know," she agreed. He straightened up. He went back to the table. He sat down across from her and said, "There's more." She said, "Tell me." He opened the tin box again. Inside, under a folded piece of canvas, were more papers. These were different from the land documents, smaller, denser, covered in writing that she recognized immediately as notes, lists, names. Someone had been keeping records. She looked at the handwriting and knew it was his. 3 years, he said. Every man Voss has moved against, every property taken, every accident that wasn't an accident, Names of the men who work for him, what they're paid, where they ride. He spread several sheets out. Dates. My brother's death is in here. What I saw. What I was able to prove, and what I couldn't. Names of 3 witnesses who were afraid to talk but told me what they knew anyway. Eliza looked at the papers. She looked at the scope of what was there. 3 years of patient, dangerous watching, recorded carefully in a man's controlled handwriting. And she thought that she had not understood yet what kind of man she had married. This is evidence, she said. It's records, he said. Evidence needs a court willing to look at it. Then we need to get it somewhere it can be looked at. Getting it somewhere requires getting off this mountain, which requires leaving the mountain undefended, which is what Voss is waiting for me to do. He gathered the papers slowly, squaring the edges. I've been sitting on this for 3 years. Jesse died because I didn't move fast enough, and I've been trying to figure out the right move ever since. She watched his hands with the papers. Careful, controlled. The same hands that had written all of it. You need someone who can take it out when you can't, she said. He looked at her. A second person changes things, she said. You've been up here alone, which means if you leave, there's no one to hold this. But if I'm here, you are not riding down a mountain alone in winter country, he said. There was an edge in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, something closer to a decision already made. That's not a possibility. I didn't say alone, she said. I said things change. We have more options now than you had a month ago. I need you to let me help think through them. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire behind him threw his face into relief, the scar visible, the set of his jaw. You've been here less than a day, he said. I know, she said, and I've already found your cracked water barrel and fixed your fireplace damper and learned where you hide your land grant. Give me a week, and I might be genuinely useful. Something moved in his face. The almost smile again. She was beginning to know it as a thing that appeared when she surprised him, when she said something that went past where he expected her to go. Go. Eat your potatoes, he said. She ate her potatoes. The first week was the hardest, not because of the work, but because of the learning curve of 2 people figuring out the geometry of a shared space they hadn't shared before. She put things in places that turned out to be his places. He came back inside from checking the trapline and found the table rearranged and stood looking at it for a full 10 seconds without saying anything. She moved the lantern to the left side of the table because the light hit the work better from there, and he moved it back to the right because that's where it had always been. And she moved it back to the left without comment, and the next morning she came out and it was on the right again. They did not fight about the lantern, but they both knew the lantern was not really about the lantern. She started sleeping in the curtained area because it was the only sleeping area, and there was no other practical arrangement. He slept near the fire on a bedroll he produced from somewhere, and she thought about that, about a man sleeping on his own floor in his own cabin. And she didn't say anything about it because the truth was, the arrangement was uncomfortable for her too, in a different way, and there wasn't a solution to any of it except time. On the 3rd morning, she went outside before he was awake, and stood in the cold air at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at the mountain. The pines went up from the clearing in a dark, solid mass, and above them the rock showed through where the tree line ended, and above that the sky was pale blue and enormous. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe through the nose, so she breathed through her mouth and watched her breath cloud and dissipate, and thought that she was very far from Pittsburgh, farther than distance measured. She heard the door behind her. He came and stood a few feet to her right, looking at the same mountain. He had his coat on, but it wasn't buttoned. He had a cup of coffee, the first pot, which meant he'd been up a while. What are you looking at? He asked. The approach, she said. If someone was coming up from below, where would they come? He looked at her sideways. The trail we came up, she said. That's the main one. But there are others. 2 others, he said. One on the west face that's barely a game trail, steep, hard to bring horses up. One on the east that's easier but exposed. They'd be visible from the cabin for a good 1/4 mile before they could reach the clearing. She nodded. So the main trail is the biggest risk. At night or in weather. She thought about the layout, about where a person standing in the clearing could see and where they couldn't. She started asking him questions, and he answered them, and somewhere in the middle of it, they were both crouched down on the frozen ground with a stick, drawing the rough shape of the mountain and the trails into the dirt, and she stopped noticing that it was cold. This was how the partnership started, not with a statement or a decision. With a stick and cold dirt, and two people who were both, in their own ways, more comfortable dealing with problems than with each other. He started teaching her to shoot that afternoon. He was not a patient teacher in the sense of being gentle or reassuring. He told her what to do, showed her once, and waited while she tried it. When she got it wrong, he told her what was wrong without softening it. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was that he was precise. He could identify exactly what she was doing wrong, whether it was her grip or her breathing or the timing of the trigger pull, and that precision was more useful than any amount of encouragement. She was not a natural. She missed the first 12 shots by distances that she found genuinely embarrassing. Her shoulder ached from the kick of the rifle and her ears rang, and she hit nothing remotely like what she was aiming at. Again, he said. I know I missed, she said. I know you know. Again. She picked up the rifle. She braced her feet the way he'd shown her. She breathed out slowly the way he'd told her to. She squeezed instead of pulling. She missed by less. Better, he said. Coming from him, that was approximately a standing ovation. By the end of the first week, she could hit a tin can at 30 paces about a third of the time. He told her that wasn't good enough, and she told him she agreed, and they kept going. She also kept working on the cabin. She rechinking the gaps in the north wall logs with a clay mixture she made from what she found. She reorganized the root cellar by type and by what would keep longest, which would matter by February. She repaired the pan handle properly with a length of wrapped rawhide, which was stronger than wire and would last the season. She found that the east window shutter had a split in it that would let wind in once the serious cold started, and she braced it with a piece of board cut to fit. Brennan watched all of it and helped with none of it because she didn't ask him to, and he seemed to understand that she needed to do it herself. But she noticed that he stopped moving her things back. The lantern stayed on the left. On the 9th day, she found the other box. She wasn't looking for anything. She was restacking the firewood along the interior wall, which he had stacked in a way that she could see would shift badly under the weight of itself once they were pulling from the bottom, and she was redoing it in the interlocking pattern her father had taught her. In the process, she shifted a large section of the stack and found, wedged against the wall behind it, a wooden box about the size of a small trunk. It had a padlock on it. She stared at it. She pushed the wood back over it and finished restacking the rest and spent the afternoon thinking about it. She thought about what Brennan had told her and what he hadn't. She thought about the tin box with its records and the hearthstone with its hidden hollow. She thought about a man who had spent 3 years building secrets into his own home. After dinner, she said, "There's a locked box behind the firewood." He was sharpening a knife. The stone made a regular sound against the blade, back and forth, back and forth. He didn't look up. "I know," he said. "What's in it?" The stone stopped. He set it and the knife on the table. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she was starting to read as the one he wore when he was deciding how much to say. "Jesse's things," he said, "and some things that belong to my father. I'm not ready to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I'm not ready to do anything with it yet." She understood then. Or she understood enough. "All right," she said. He picked up the knife and the stone. "You're not curious?" he said. "I'm very curious," she said. "But curious isn't the same as needing to know right this minute." He looked at her again, the same measuring look as before. "Most people push," he said. "I know," she said. "It doesn't usually get them what they want." He went back to the knife. She went back to the mending she'd been doing, a tear in the knee of her work pants, and the fire talked between them in the way fires do, snapping and settling. After a while he said, "Jesse was 23. She kept her eyes on the mending. "Was he like you?" "No, Jesse talked. Jesse laughed at everything. He could make anybody feel like they were the most interesting person in the room." He turned the knife over in his hands. "I was always the serious one. He said I was serious enough for both of us, so he didn't have to be." She let that sit. She pushed the needle through the heavy canvas of the pants. "He came up here in August," Brennan said, 2 years back August, checking the upper trap line, the way he did every season. Voss's men were waiting. He said it flat, clinical, the way you talk about something when you've told it to yourself enough times that you've removed most of the sound from it. They said he fired first. He didn't have a rifle with him. He never carried one on the trap line. The needle went in and came out. "I'm going to tell you something," Eliza said. And then I'm not going to bring it up again unless you want to." He waited. "When Voss put the eviction notice on my mother's door," she said, "my mother was in the back room. She couldn't get up. She'd been sick for 6 weeks, and he didn't wait to see if anyone was coming out. He just nailed it up and rode away." She paused. "She died 4 weeks later. The bank moved on the property while I was still arranging the burial." Silence. "I don't know if that man and your man are the same man," she said, "but I know the feeling of someone with a badge making something terrible look like paperwork. And I know what it cost you after." He didn't say anything for a long time. The fire moved. The knife was still in his hands. "I think they are the same man," he said finally. "Voss moved east 2 years before he came back here with his badge. 3, 4 years maybe. The timing fits." She looked up from the mending. He was looking at the fire. "He took something from both of us," she said. "Yes," he said. "He did." It was the first moment she felt that they were not two strangers who happened to have signed their names on the same document. It was not warmth, exactly. It was something more like recognition. Two people who had come from different directions to stand in front of the same fire, and finding that the fire was real, and that they were both real, and that the thing they'd both lost had weight and shape, and was worth the cost of whatever came next. She went back to the mending. He went back to the knife. Outside, the wind moved down off the high peaks and found the cabin walls and tested them, the way it did every night, looking for weakness. It didn't find any. She had seen to that. The snow came on the 14th day. Not the first snow. There had been dustings before, thin white coatings that melted by noon. But the real snow, the snow that meant something, coming down from the north in thick, heavy curtains that cut visibility to 30 yards and covered the cleared ground in 4 inches inside 2 hours. She stood at the window and watched it. Brennan came up beside her. "Here it comes," she said. "Yes," he said. She thought about everything that was now on the other side of that snow. The trail down, the town, the territorial office, the world that operated by daylight, and paperwork and people who could be appealed to. She thought about how the snow changed the shape of things, narrowed the options down to what was directly in front of you. She thought that maybe she had always worked better that way, without too many options, without the exits clearly marked. She turned away from the window. She had bread to start. She'd mixed the dough the night before, and it had been rising slowly in the warmth near the fire, and it needed to go in the Dutch oven while the heat was right. She went to it and turned the dough out, and the smell of it, yeasty and warm and alive, filled the cabin immediately. Brennan turned from the window and looked at her. "I haven't smelled that in a long time," he said. "Bread takes about an hour in that Dutch oven," she said, "depending on the fire." He sat down at the table. She shaped the loaf. Outside, the snow kept coming, and the mountain settled into its winter silence. And inside the cabin, something that had been stiff and separate between the two of them loosened, slightly, the way cold things do when they get close enough to heat. It wasn't love. She wasn't foolish enough to call it that. Not yet. Not after 2 weeks and a shared fire and a conversation about grief. But it was something. It was, she thought, a beginning. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that you only recognize looking back. The quiet kind. The kind that holds. She put the Dutch oven on the coals and sat down across from him, and they waited for the bread to rise. The bread had been a kind of turning point, though neither of them said so. After that first loaf, dense and slightly uneven because the Dutch oven ran hotter on one side than the other, a flaw she noted and corrected the next time, something in the daily rhythm of the cabin changed. Not dramatically, not the way things change in stories, where a single moment reshapes everything in an instant. It was more like the way ice changes in early spring, where you look at it one morning and realize the edges have softened without your noticing when it happened. Brennan began talking more. Not a lot more, but enough. He would come in from checking the trap line and say something about what he'd seen, fresh elk sign on the upper trail, a section of fence that needed attention before the heavy snow made it inaccessible. And she would answer, and they would talk for a few minutes in the way people talk when they're actually listening to each other rather than waiting for their turn. She told him about Pittsburgh. Not the hard parts, not yet, but the ordinary parts. The bakery before it went wrong. The neighborhood. The way the city sounded at 4 in the morning when she was the only one awake and the only light on the block was coming from her own window. He listened the way he did everything else, completely, without interrupting. In return, he told her things about the mountain. where the best water came from in late winter when the mainspring slowed, which of the high trails became dangerous after fresh snow, and which were solid even in the worst conditions. The signs that told you weather was coming before the sky gave anything away. The way the pines moved, the behavior of the camp jays, a particular quality in the air that he said was more something you felt in your chest than anything you could describe with words. She filed all of it. She had always been good at filing information, at building a working map of a new situation piece by piece until she could navigate it without thinking. The mountain was becoming, slowly, something she could read. Her shooting improved. She could hit the tin can at 30 paces reliably now, and Brennan had moved the target back to 50, and she was building the muscle memory for the rifle the way she had once built the muscle memory for bread. The same motion, repeated until the hands knew what to do without being told. Her shoulder had stopped hurting. That had taken 2 weeks, and she had not mentioned the pain while it lasted because mentioning it would not have made it stop. She was out at the practice range, a flat section of ground east of the cabin where he'd set up a line of targets at varying distances. On the morning the first serious trouble arrived. The snow had come and gone twice since the first real fall. They were into what Brennan called the shoulder of winter, that period between the first heavy snow and the deep freeze, when the weather was unpredictable and the days shortened fast. The temperature had dropped sharply the night before. The sky was the color of old pewter. She heard the horses before she saw anything. She had learned to listen differently on the mountain. Back east, horse sounds were part of the general background noise of a living city, indistinguishable from everything else. Up here, where the only sounds were wind and birds and the occasional crack of a settling tree, a sound that didn't belong arrived clean and clear. She heard hooves on the frozen trail, the main trail, the one from below, and she heard more than one set of them. She lowered the rifle. She had left Brennan inside, going through his records again, doing whatever accounting he did of his own intelligence, cross-referencing dates, she suspected, looking for patterns she hadn't seen yet. She did not call out to him. Instead, she moved to the east side of the cabin and looked around the corner toward the trail opening. 3 riders, coming up slow, the way riders come when they're not sure what's waiting for them at the top. They were bundled against the cold in heavy coats, hats pulled down. She couldn't see faces from this angle, but she could see the deliberate pace, the way they were spread slightly apart on the trail, not bunched the way travelers bunch, separated the way men spread out when they're expecting trouble and don't want to make an easy group target. She went inside. Brennan looked up the instant she came through the door. He read her face. "How many?" he said. 3. On the main trail. Coming slow. He was on his feet before she finished. He went to the east window and looked through the gap in the shutter. She could see his shoulders settle into a particular stillness that she recognized by now as the opposite of relaxation. It was concentration, the way he went very still when he was thinking very fast. "I don't know them," he said, "from this distance. Could be travelers. Could be." He didn't believe it. She could hear that he didn't believe it. "What do we do?" she asked. "You stay back from the windows and keep that rifle ready," he said. "I'll go out." "Brennan, I know these men, or men like them. If I stay inside, it reads as fear. If I go out, I control the ground." He checked his own rifle, quick and practiced. "Stay at the window. If it goes wrong, you'll know." "How will I know?" "You'll know," he said. He went out. She went to the window. She watched through the shutter gap. He walked to the center of the clearing and stopped and stood and waited. The 3 riders came up off the trail into the open ground and pulled up when they saw him. She could see them better now. The man in the middle was heavy-set, running to fat under a sheepskin coat, with a short dark beard and the kind of face that looked used to expecting deference. She didn't know him. The 2 flanking him were thinner, younger, hired men by the look of their gear. One of them had his hand resting near his holster in the studied casual way of someone who wants you to notice that. The exchange was too far for her to hear clearly. She caught fragments. Brennan's voice, even and unhurried. The heavy-set man's voice, louder, with the carrying tone of a man accustomed to making pronouncements. Something about land. Something about a name she didn't catch. Brennan shook his head. The heavy-set man said something else. Shorter, sharper. The 2 flanking men moved slightly, not much, just a shift of weight that changed their positions in a way that was almost certainly deliberate. Brennan's right hand didn't move toward his rifle. He kept both hands visible, easy, and said something in a tone so level she couldn't read it from 30 yards. Then the heavy-set man laughed, and it was not a good laugh, and he turned his horse and the three of them went back down the trail. But slowly, with the deliberate slowness of men who want you to know they're leaving by choice, not because they have to. Brennan watched them all the way to the tree line. He came back inside and latched the door. "Who were they?" she asked. "The one in the middle is named Greer. He manages one of the syndicate operations, one valley over." He set his rifle against the wall. He was delivering a message. "What message?" "That Voss knows I came back with a wife. That Voss considers this winter the last one I'll spend on this mountain." He went to the table and sat. He sat heavily, the way a man sits when he's tired, not from physical work, but from the weight of something he's been carrying a long time. He said Voss would be willing to arrange a settlement, compensation for the water rights, enough money to start somewhere else. Eliza sat across from him. And I told him the same thing I've told them for 3 years. He looked at his hands. "No." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "They'll come back." "Yes." "Not to talk." "No, not to talk." He looked up. "I want you to learn the east window position. I want you to understand the angles of the clearing, which positions give you a shot and which put you in someone else's line of sight. I need you to be able to work with me if they come in numbers." She nodded. "Show me." He showed her. That afternoon and the next morning, he walked her through every position around the cabin and explained the shooting angles from each, the dead zones where cover worked against you as well as for you, the way the granite outcrop on the north side created a natural choke point that anyone approaching from that direction would have to pass through. She asked questions. He answered them. She found she could hold the spatial layout in her mind the way she held a recipe, each component in its place, the sequence of steps clear. She did not tell him she was afraid. She was. But the fear was in its right place, behind the thinking, available to sharpen the attention rather than scramble it. 3 weeks passed. The heavy freeze settled in. The temperature dropped to a kind of cold that was not like any cold she had known before. Not the wet Pennsylvania cold that chilled through layers of clothing, but a dry, absolute cold that felt less like weather and more like physics, like the air itself changing state. She learned to move differently in it, to keep her face covered, to never let herself sweat because sweat in that cold was dangerous, to pay attention to the feeling in her fingers and her ears and her nose. She also kept baking. She kept cooking. She fixed the things that needed fixing and made the cabin function better than it had before she arrived. And she kept shooting every day she could until the tin cans at 50 paces were reliable and he moved them back further. They were not yet easy with each other in the way of people who have been a long time in the same space, but they had found a working rhythm, a way of occupying the cabin that left room for both of them. He stopped moving things she'd placed. She stopped trying to talk when he needed quiet. They developed small habits, the way people do, who got the first coffee, who took the outer position checking the perimeter, who banked the fire last at night. She thought about the locked box sometimes. She thought about Jesse Holt, 23 years old and carrying no rifle, and a marshal who had ridden away from her mother's door without looking back. She let herself think about it and then put it away, because there was work to do, and anger was only useful when you had something to aim it at. The blizzard arrived on a Thursday. She knew it was Thursday because she had been keeping a small calendar on a piece of board with a charcoal mark for each day, which she started because, in a place where the days began to look alike, she had decided that keeping track of time was a small act of will that mattered. Thursday, November 14th. 6 weeks and 2 days since she had come up the mountain. The storm came from the northwest. The direction Brennan had told her was always the worst one. It arrived in phases. First a wind that hit the cabin like something had decided to push it sideways off the mountain, then the snow, driven horizontal, the kind of snow that isn't falling so much as moving through the air in a mass. Within an hour, the visibility outside was 0. Within 2 hours, the snow against the north wall was up to the first log course. They were sealed in. She had been through 2 days of preparation before it hit. Brennan had read the signs she was still learning and told her it was coming, and they had moved methodically through every item on a list she'd helped put together, checking supplies, securing the horses in the lean-to shelter he'd built against the south face of the granite outcrop, bringing in extra firewood until it was stacked to the ceiling along the interior wall. She had felt oddly calm during all of it. The work helped. The work always helped. They sat inside on that first night and listened to the wind find every small gap and imperfection in the walls and test it. Most held. She had rechinked the worst of the north wall gaps, and she felt a grim satisfaction when the wind came and the cabin didn't fill with cold air the way it had before. "You did good work on this place," Brennan said. He was looking at the north wall while the wind pressed on it. "It needed it," she said. "It did," he said. "It needed it a long time. He stopped. "You were managing alone," she said. "You handle the things that are immediate. The rest waits." He looked at her. "You're not irritated at me for that?" "Why would I be irritated? I'm not the one who lived here alone for 7 years." He was quiet a moment. "Most people would take that as an insult. The state of things." "I'm not most people," she said. "And the state of things is fixed. It doesn't matter how it got there." He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight, and she had the sense, not for the first time, that he was trying to figure out what to do with her. She understood the feeling. She'd spent a fair amount of the past 6 weeks trying to figure out what to do with him. The blizzard held them for 4 days. Not a blizzard that stopped and started, but one continuous, relentless storm that showed no interest in being finished with them. They played cards. She taught him a game her father had played, a Pennsylvania Dutch game with complicated rules for the trump suit, and he was bad at it the first time and better the second time, and by the 4th time she had to pay actual attention to beat him, which annoyed her and pleased her in equal measure. He told her more about Jesse, not in one piece, but in fragments, the way grief usually comes out, in the spaces between other things. He told her about teaching Jesse to set a trap line when he was 12. About the winter, Jesse had gotten turned around in a storm, not unlike this one, and had come home 2 days later, perfectly fine, slightly embarrassed, having spent the time sheltered in a deadfall that he claimed was actually comfortable. About the particular noise Jesse made when something struck him as funny, a sound Brennan described as more of an explosion than a laugh, which made her smile to imagine. She told him more about her mother, about the bakery. She told him about the loan and the man who had held it, and how she had spent 6 months trying to refinance it through every legitimate channel available before understanding that there were no legitimate channels available, that the deck had been arranged before she sat down at the table. She told him that she had suspected Voss was involved even before she knew his name, because the pattern of it, the way doors closed, the way help evaporated, the way legal avenues became suddenly and inexplicably dead ends, bore the marks of someone with the kind of authority that bends things. Brennan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He's been doing this for a long time, all of it, the syndicate, the land, the water. It's one operation. He moved east, ran the same scheme in a smaller way, moved on before it caught up with him. He takes what people can't easily prove he's taken," she said. "Yes, he's careful that way." She thought about the records in the tin box, about the documents behind the hearthstone. Then we need to be more careful than he is. On the 4th night of the storm, she woke to a sound. She lay still in the dark, which was absolute. No fire. It had died down to coals. And she listened. The wind was still there, still pushing, but underneath it she had heard something else, a sound that didn't match the storm. She couldn't identify it. She lay still and let her mind work the way her mind worked in the dark, without the distraction of what she could see, just listening. It came again, from the south side, near the lean-to where the horses were. She got up. She found her boots without light, by feel, and put them on, and found her coat. She found the rifle by the bed where she'd started keeping it. She went to the south window and opened the shutter a crack. The snow was thinner on the south side, sheltered by the granite outcrop. She could see maybe 10 yards. Nothing moved in those 10 yards. But the horses were not making the sounds horses make when they're settled. She could hear them through the wall of the lean-to. Short, clipped sounds, not frantic but alert, the sounds of animals that have noticed something. She crossed to where Brennan was sleeping and put her hand on his shoulder. He was awake before she could speak. She had learned that about him. He came awake instantly, without the slow surfacing of most people. He was just asleep, and then he was awake, and the rifle was in his hand. "South side," she said quietly. "Horses are uneasy." He was on his feet. He went to the south window, looked through the crack, listened. He held up 2 fingers. She didn't know if that meant he could see two things or he was guessing at two. She moved to the other side of the window to give them angles. Then she heard it, a sound against the door, not like wind, like something testing the latch, testing it carefully, the way you test a thing when you don't want whoever's inside to notice. Everything in her body went very cold and very clear at the same time. This was the moment. She had known it was coming. They had both known. And she had thought about it and prepared for it and tried to understand what it would feel like when it actually arrived. But she understood now that you cannot understand that in advance. You can only find out what you're made of when the moment is actually there. She looked at Brennan. He was looking at her. He pointed at her, then at the east window. He pointed at himself, then at the door. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed at the door, meaning 3 at the door. She didn't know how he knew, but she trusted that he did. She moved to the east window. She opened the shutter an inch. She looked out and saw, in the dim gray light of a stormed night, a shape at the northeast corner of the cabin. A man, pressed against the wall, moving toward the door. She thought fast. If he fired at her east window, she would be in direct line. She shifted 2 feet back from the window, so she had angle but not exposure. She brought the rifle up. Her hands were steady. She had not expected that. She was surprised by her own hands. The door latch lifted. Brennan was behind the table, which he had moved, she realized. He had moved it sometime in the last hour before she woke, moved it to give himself cover, and to give the people coming through the door nothing to use. She had not heard him do it. He had been awake before she was. The door opened. Cold air and snow hit the room and 2 men came through fast, one going left and one going right, the way people are trained to enter a contested space. A third came through right behind them. Brennan fired. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, enormous and wrong in a way that her body registered as a full physical shock, even though she had heard the rifle before, many times, at the practice range. This was different. The world restructured itself around the sound. One of the men went down on the left. The other 2 fired back and the table took the hits, solid, and she heard Brennan move behind it. She had the man at the northeast corner of the cabin in her sights through the east window. He had moved to the door now, bringing a rifle up toward the opening. She fired. She missed the first shot. The sound of it brought the man around toward her window, and she dropped below the sill, and the shot he fired hit the shutter above her head, and she felt the split and spray of wood on her hair, and she came back up and found him again and fired once more, and this time she did not miss. I went down outside the cabin wall. Inside, noise and motion. She couldn't see clearly. The smoke from the shots was thick in the closed air. But she heard struggle, heard something crash against the wall, heard a sound she would not be able to name later, something between a grunt and a shout. She was up and moving toward the door with the rifle because 2 men had come through and one was down and one was still there, and Brennan was somewhere in the smoke. She found the second man before she could think about it. He was against the east wall trying to get around the table, and he was bigger than Brennan, and he had a knife because the rifle was somewhere on the floor. She had 1 shot. She had reloaded at the window without deciding to do it, the reloading just happening because she had done it enough times that her hands did it without her. She fired from 6 feet away, and the man went down, and she stood there with the empty rifle and the smoke and the cold from the open door, and her own breathing loud in her ears like the bellows on an overworked furnace. "Eliza," Brennan's voice, from near the fireplace. She crossed the room in 3 steps. He was on the floor leaning against the stone of the fireplace base. He had his hand pressed to his left side. His face in the darkness was the face of a man working very hard to keep hold of something. She dropped to her knees. She moved his hand. The knife wound was in his left side, below the ribs. She could see it even in the dim light. The bleeding was heavy. She pressed his hand back. "How bad?" he said. She was already thinking, already moving through the catalog of what she had, what she knew, what she had watched her mother's doctor do, and read about in the 1 medical pamphlet she'd picked up in Caldwell at the last moment, half out of instinct and half out of a feeling she hadn't let herself fully examine. "You're going to need stitches," she said, "and I need to stop the bleeding first." The men are done," she said. "Stay still." "Eliza." His hand came up and caught her wrist. His grip was still strong, which she took as a sign that he had not lost too much. Not yet. "Are you hurt?" She thought about the wood splitting above her head, the spray of it. "No," she said. He let go of her wrist. She got up and closed the door. She got the fire going from the coals. It took 3 minutes that felt like 30, the kindling catching slowly, her hands finally shaking now that they had something less than rifle work to do, the shaking she hadn't been able to afford before arriving now. She built it up, fast, and got a lantern lit. She went back to Brennan. In the light, the wound was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. Deep, but not in the right place to have hit anything that would kill him fast. But it was bleeding seriously, and it needed to be closed, and she had never sewn a wound in her life. She had sewn leather. She had sewn canvas. She had sewn the tear in her work pants by firelight. A wound was not so different in its mechanics, she told herself, and knew that was not entirely true, and told herself anyway because the alternative was paralysis. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean, it's going to hurt a great deal." "I know that too. Do it." She used the whiskey from the shelf. He had a bottle, nearly full, which she had wondered about once and not asked, for the wound and for the needle. She used the sharpest needle in her sewing kit, the one she used for the heaviest canvas, and she used the strongest thread she had. She moved the lantern to give herself the best light possible. She worked. He made one sound, at the beginning, and then he was silent. She could feel him controlling it, the way she could feel the tension in him, the deliberate discipline of a man who had decided not to make this harder for her than it already was. She was grateful for it and hated that she needed to be grateful for it. She did 12 stitches. They were not pretty stitches. A surgeon would have been appalled by them. They were what they were, tight and functional, the kind of stitches that would hold if he didn't move too much. And she told him that, told him he needed to stay still, and he said he would. When it was done, she bound it tight with strips of the cleanest cloth she had, her second blouse, which she tore into strips without ceremony, and she helped him off the floor and onto the sleeping area and covered him with everything she had that would hold warmth. She sat down on the floor beside the sleeping area because there was nowhere else to sit and because she needed a moment where she was not moving. She sat there for a while. The fire cracked. The wind pressed on the walls. Outside, 3 men were in the snow, and she did not think about that directly because she could not afford to think about it directly. Not yet. She would deal with what that meant later, when she could. She looked at Brennan. His face in the firelight was pale but not gray. His breathing was steady. His eyes were closed, but she didn't think he was asleep. "Brennan?" she said. "I'm here," he said, without opening his eyes. "You're going to be all right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You didn't freeze." "No," she said. "I didn't know for certain if you would." "Neither did I," she said. He opened his eyes then and looked at her, and she looked back, and what passed between them in that look was not something she could have put into words and didn't try to. It was just there, plain and solid and real, the way the hearthstone was real, and the mountains outside were real, and the stitches she had put in him were real. "Sleep," she said. "I'll watch." He closed his eyes. She got up and reloaded both rifles, and put one within his reach, and kept the other in her own hands. And she sat by the fire and listened to the storm outside gradually, over the hours, begin to tire itself out, and she did not sleep, and she did not cry. And by morning the wind had dropped to something bearable, and Brennan was still breathing, and she was still there. The days after the attack had a particular texture that Eliza would remember for the rest of her life. Not dramatic, not the way she might have expected, given what had happened. Instead, they were slow and close and exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical work, though there was plenty of that. The bodies had to be dealt with. She did it herself, because Brennan could not be moved, and she did it without thinking about it directly in the same way she had learned to do difficult things in the bakery, by focusing on the mechanics and letting the meaning of it come later when she had space for it. She dragged them to the far edge of the clearing and covered them with snow and stones and did not stand over them for long. She cleaned the cabin. She scrubbed the floor with the stiff brush and snow water heated on the fire until the boards were as clean as she could get them, which was not entirely clean, but clean enough. She repaired the door latch, which had been damaged when the men forced it. She plugged the hole in the east shutter where the shot had come through with a piece of board and pine pitch, working from inside with her hands going numb from the cold air coming through the gap. All of this she did while keeping one ear on Brennan, who was in the sleeping area and who was, for the first 2 days, in a condition that frightened her more than the gunfight had. The wound itself held. Her stitches held, ugly as they were. What she had not anticipated was the fever. It came on the second morning, fast the way fever in a wound comes fast. And by afternoon he was burning and confused, and she was doing things she had only read about. Cold cloths on his forehead and neck, broth pushed on him in small amounts every hour, checking the wound for the particular smell and color that the pamphlet she'd bought in Caldwell had described as the signs that meant the end of things. She checked it 4 times a day. She memorized what it looked like. She noted every change. He was not lucid for most of the second and third days. He talked sometimes, not to her or not only to her. He said Jessie's name twice. He said something she couldn't make out, repeated several times, that might have been a place name. She answered him steadily, in a low voice, when he seemed to be asking something, and she tried not to let him hear what she was actually feeling, which was a fear so large and cold it made the temperature outside seem manageable by comparison. She was not going to let him die. She had decided that with the same practical clarity she had applied to the water barrel and the fireplace damper, and she worked at it with the same methodical persistence. If that seemed an absurd thing, to decide against death the way you decide to fix a crack in a wood stave, she didn't care. She had very little left to work with, and stubbornness was at the top of the list. On the 4th day, the fever broke. She knew it before she saw his eyes open, knew it from the quality of his breathing, which had been shallow and too fast and suddenly was slower and deeper, like a man who has been running and has stopped. She was sitting on the floor next to the sleeping area. She had been sleeping there, on a folded blanket, 2 or 3 hours at a time, never more. And she felt the change in him before she was fully awake. She got up and looked at him. His eyes were open, clear. The glaze that had been in them for 3 days was gone. He looked at her for a moment and said, his voice rough from disuse, "You look terrible." She sat down on the edge of the sleeping area. Her legs had made the decision for her. She felt something that might have been laughter trying to happen somewhere in her chest, and it came out wrong, more like a sound than anything, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and waited for it to pass. "Thank you," she said when it had. He tried to push himself up, and she put her hand on his shoulder. "Don't. You need to stay flat. You have 12 stitches in your side, and you've been running a fever for 3 days, and you are not getting up." He looked at her hand on his shoulder. He looked at her face. He lay back down. 3 days, he said. 4, nearly. He was quiet, absorbing that. The men, dealt with. He understood what that meant. He looked at the ceiling. By yourself. There was no one else to do it, she said. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression. Something she didn't have a word for. Something that had to do with understanding a thing you had thought you understood before but had not fully. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. "It needed doing." "Eliza, eat something," she said. "I have broth on the fire. It's been on the fire for 2 days, so I won't make any claims about how it tastes, but it's hot." She got up and went to the fire before he could say whatever he was going to say next, because she was not ready to receive whatever it was. Not yet. Not while she was still this tired and this hollowed out. There would be time for it later. There was time for most things later, if you were still breathing. He drank the broth. He kept it down. She took that as the best news she'd had in 4 days. He healed slowly, which she had expected, and impatiently, which she had also expected. By the 6th day, he was trying to get up. By the 7th day, he had succeeded over her objection and had made it to the table and sat there for an hour going through his records with the look on his face that she recognized as the look he wore when he was angry and had no useful outlet for it. By the 9th day, he was moving around the cabin, carefully, guarding the left side, but moving. She checked the stitches every morning. They were holding. The wound was closing the way it was supposed to close, which was slowly and imperfectly, but in the right direction. "Voss will know the men didn't come back," Brennan said on the 10th day. He was at the table. She was at the fire. The storm had long since passed, and the world outside was the particular brilliant white silence of deep winter after hard weather. "Yes," she said. "He'll come himself. He won't send more hired men, not after losing 3. He'll want to see it finished." She stirred the pot. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. He'll want the pass to clear enough for travel. Another 2 weeks, maybe 3. He paused. "He'll bring deputies, official. He's smart enough to want the legal cover." She thought about that. About Caleb Voss, whom she had never seen up close but had seen from across a street, riding a gray horse, nailing a paper to a door. about what it would mean to have him come up this mountain with a badge and deputies and the machinery of corrupt authority behind him. She said, "Then we need to be ready for him." "With me half healed." "You won't be half healed in 2 weeks," she said. "You'll be 3/4. Stop counting what you don't have and count what we do." He looked at her. "We have the ground," she said. "We know this clearing. We know every angle. He doesn't." She turned from the fire. "And he's expecting a wounded trapper and a woman who doesn't belong here. He is going to be wrong about at least one of those things." Something happened in his face, the same thing that had happened on the 11th day of the line in Caldwell, when she'd corrected him about the bakery. Recognition, she thought, or something close to it. "What are you thinking?" he said. She sat down across from him. "I'm thinking about the cellar," she said. The root cellar, the one accessed by the trapdoor in the floor, was 6 feet deep, 8 feet long, 4 feet wide. She had been in it dozens of times for potatoes and preserved goods. She knew its dimensions exactly, knew the way the trapdoor sat flush with the floor and was nearly invisible under the hide rug she kept over it, knew the angle of the ladder and the way the space was arranged. She explained what she was thinking. Brennan listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously, because Brennan always interrupted when he disagreed. He let her finish. Then he said, "The trapdoor. If it's covered right, in dim light, a man coming in fast won't see it," she said. "The rug moves." "Not if it's tacked," she said. "Tacked loosely, so the weight of someone stepping on it breaks the tacks. They go through. We clear the cellar of everything so there's nothing to land on but the floor, and the fall is enough to stun." He was looking at the trapdoor, at the rug over it, measuring something in his head. 2 men, maybe 3. At most. He'll leave some outside. She paused. "I want him to think I'm alone in here." Brennan looked at her sharply. "If he sees you," she said, "he'll be cautious. He knows what you're capable of. He's been working around you for 3 years. She held his gaze. "If he thinks it's just me, a woman, alone, with a wounded husband who can barely stand, he'll walk through that door without enough care. And I'll be in the lean-to," she said, "on the south side behind the granite, close enough to move when the time comes. I'm not hiding behind a rock while you You'll be positioned," she said, "not hiding. You'll have the angle on the deputies outside. I'll have the inside." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it, checking it against everything he knew about the clearing and the approaches and the way Voss operated. She waited. "He'll have 4 deputies," he said finally. "Maybe 5. How many do you think you can handle on your own, from the south position?" He thought about it with the honesty she had come to appreciate. 2, clean, 3 if they bunch. He touched his left side without seeming to notice he was doing it. "If they spread out, it gets complicated." "Then we need them to bunch," she said, "which means something needs to draw their attention to one point before you move." "What point?" "Me," she said. "At the door. When Voss goes inside, I come out. The deputies will look at me. They'll have 1 second where their attention is divided and their eyes are adjusting to outside light after watching a dark doorway." She looked at him steadily. 1 second is enough. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You've been planning this," he said. "I've had 2 weeks and a sick man to look after and not much else to do," she said. "Eliza." He stopped. He put his hand flat on the table between them. "If this goes wrong—" "I know," she said. "If it goes wrong, there is no one coming. Nobody knows to come." "I know," she said again, and her voice was steady, and she met his eyes without flinching, because the alternative, waiting, hoping, being managed, was not something she was built for anymore, if she ever had been. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He said, "The tacks for the rug. Use the square ones from the small box on the bottom shelf. They'll hold just enough, but not more." She nodded. "And I want 2 practice runs," he said. "Full speed. I need to know exactly how fast you can get from the door to the east window." "All right," she said. They spent the next 3 days preparing. He was not strong enough to do the heavy work, so she did it, under his instruction, which was an odd arrangement that suited them both. Him directing from the table with the focused attention of a man who knows a problem intimately, her moving through the cabin, making the changes, the two of them going back and forth until each detail was right. She moved the furniture. She tacked the rug. She cleared the cellar and laid a folded piece of hide on the floor below the trapdoor. Not enough to cushion badly, but enough to muffle the sound of impact, so a man going in might not alert the others immediately. She repositioned the water barrel to the east side of the door, where it gave her something to put her back against when she needed it, and also served as a barrier. She arranged the items on the shelf above the fireplace so that the thing she needed was accessible without fumbling. The thing on the shelf was the pot. The largest one, the one she used for stew, a cast iron piece that held 8 quarts and was heavy enough that she had to use both hands to lift it when it was full. She tested, over and over, how fast she could fill it from the kettle she would keep hot on the fire and how fast she could move from the fire to the door with it full and the heat of it. Brennan watched her practice this and said nothing. The look on his face was complex. "What?" she said on the 4th run. "Nothing," he said. "You're making a face." "I'm not making a face." "You're thinking something," she said. I was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking I chose better than I knew I was choosing," he said. She set the pot down. She looked at him across the cabin. He was still pale from the fever, still moving carefully, still not the man she had met in Caldwell. Not yet, not fully. But he was close, getting closer every day, and his eyes were clear and direct and looking at her with something she had been aware of for a while now but had not named, because naming it felt like a claim she hadn't earned yet, or couldn't make honestly given everything that was still unresolved between them. She said, "Get some rest. You need to be at full capacity when they come." He said, "Eliza." "Brennan?" She picked up the pot. "Rest." He rested. Voss came on a Thursday. Her charcoal calendar said the 16th of January. She knew the party was coming the morning before because the camp jays disappeared from the area around the cabin, which Brennan had told her meant something large and disruptive was moving through the lower mountain, and large and disruptive in January on this mountain meant men, not animals. She spent that evening going through everything one more time. The cellar was clear, the rug was tacked, the kettle was filled. The rifle was in its position at the east window, reloaded, with 2 additional rounds on the sill. She ate a good meal, which she did deliberately, because she had learned that fear made her not want to eat, and she could not afford that particular indulgence. Brennan came to the table while she was eating and sat across from her, and they went through it one more time, every position, every signal. His left side was strapped tight, which would affect his speed and his ability to twist, and they had accounted for that in the positions they'd assigned him. "If Voss stays outside," he said, "then we change the plan. I'll signal from the window." They had worked out the signals. "If there are more than 5 deputies, then I adapt. Brennan." She looked at him. "We've been through every version of this. At some point we have to trust the work." He looked at the table. "I know." "You've been alone with this for 3 years," she said. "You've been thinking about Voss and Jesse and the water rights and the way out of it for 3 years, by yourself, and every problem looks different when you're the only one holding it." She waited until he looked at her. "You're not the only one holding it now?" He held her gaze for a long moment. Something in his face that had been tight for as long as she'd known him, a compression, a holding in, seemed not to release exactly, but to give a fraction of an inch. "No," he said, "I'm not." He went to the lean-to before first light, and she closed the cabin and waited. The waiting was the hardest thing. Harder than the preparations, harder than the stitching, harder than the 3 days of fever. She sat at the table with the fire going and the kettle hot, and listened to the mountain with every part of herself she had, and the minutes were long and strange in the way that minutes are when you are waiting for something that will change everything. They came at mid-morning. She heard them on the main trail, more than she'd heard before, more horses, and when she looked through the shutter crack she counted 6 riders and felt the number land in her stomach like something swallowed too fast. Voss was in the front. She recognized him immediately. She had seen him only once, from across the street in Pittsburgh, but the gray horse was the same or near enough the same, and the way he held himself in the saddle was the same, upright, deliberate, a man comfortable with the weight of his own authority. He was older than she remembered, thicker through the chest. The badge on his coat caught the winter light. 5 deputies behind him, not 4. She noted that and adjusted. She stepped back from the window and put her hand on the kettle handle for a moment, not to pick it up, but just to touch it, to remind herself that it was there. She heard him call out from the clearing, a carrying voice, a voice trained to carry. "Holt, federal business. Come out." She went to the door. She opened it and stood in the frame and looked out at Caleb Voss on his gray horse with 5 armed deputies behind him. And she made sure her face showed nothing beyond a woman alone in a winter cabin, tired and uncertain, with a sick husband inside. "Mr. Voss," she said. She made her voice smaller than it was. She had practiced that too. He looked at her the way she had expected him to look at her. The swift assessment of a man who sees a category before he sees a person, who decides what he's dealing with in the first second and does not revisit the question. Big woman, alone, no threat. She could see him decide it. She watched it happen. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "Where's your husband?" "Inside," she said. He was hurt, Mr. Voss. Some men came a few weeks back. He got stabbed and he's been bad since. I've been managing on my own." She let some of the real exhaustion of the past weeks into her voice, which wasn't difficult because it was there. "I'm glad you've come. I didn't know what to do." She watched his eyes. She had learned, running a bakery counter, to watch eyes because eyes told you what a person had already decided before their mouth got around to saying it. His eyes said he believed her. "I need to speak with him," Voss said, "about some legal matters." "Of course," she said. She stepped back from the door. "Please come in." She moved to the east side of the room, near the fire, near the kettle, as Voss dismounted and handed his reins to a deputy. She watched him gesture to the others. 3 of them moved toward the cabin door, which was 2 more than she had wanted inside, but she had accounted for this. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She kept her face soft. She was a tired woman in a winter cabin, glad to see anyone, even a marshal with a badge and bad intentions. Voss came through the door first. He looked around the cabin with the practiced sweep of a man who had entered many contested spaces. His eyes went to the table, to the sleeping area curtain, to the shelves. He moved left toward the middle of the room. The first deputy came in and went right. Standard entry behavior, exactly what she'd planned for. The second deputy came in behind him and moved left close to Voss toward the center of the room. They were on the rug. Both of them. Voss 1 step left of center, the first deputy 2 steps right. The third deputy stopped in the doorway. Eliza took 1 step toward the fire and picked up the kettle. She made it look like she was going to the table, the way you carry a kettle to serve something hot. A natural movement, a woman getting ready to play host. Then she moved the kettle to her right, and she used her left shoulder to drive hard into the deputy in the doorway, putting her full weight, all of her, every pound she had, every year of kneading dough and hauling flour and building muscle without ever thinking of it as building muscle, into the motion, and the deputy went through the doorway backwards and off the step and hit the frozen ground outside. In the same motion, she turned and threw the contents of the kettle. Not at Voss. At the first deputy, who was between her and Voss, who was the thing she needed to remove from the equation fastest. The boiling water hit him across the back and neck, and he made a sound that was not like any sound she wanted to remember, and he went to his knees. The rug tacks had been pulled by the weight of 2 men moving on it. The section under Voss shifted. Not collapsed. She had not expected collapse. She had planned for shift, for the moment where a man's footing is uncertain, where instinct takes over from training, and a man steps back to find solid ground and finds the edge of the trapdoor instead. Voss stepped back. His right foot found nothing. He went in sideways, one arm catching the trapdoor edge, and the sound of him hitting the cellar floor was not what she wanted to remember either, but it was what it was. She had the cellar door down and the latch in before he could recover. The latch was a piece she had made herself, a simple bar that slipped through 2 brackets, and it held. She was at the east window in 3 steps. Outside, she could hear the sounds of what Brennan was doing from his position at the granite outcrop, and she did not let herself think about it except in the most immediate and practical way, which was, he is still shooting, which means he is still standing. She had the rifle. The deputy she'd shouldered off the step was getting up. She put the rifle on him and said clearly and without shouting, "Don't!" He stopped. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. He made a calculation. He put his hands up. From the south side of the clearing, she heard Brennan's voice, carrying hard and flat. "Down, all of you. Down now." 2 shots. Then silence. Then the sound of men deciding the math didn't work in their favor. She kept the rifle on the deputy in front of her. She could hear Voss below the floor, moving, and then his voice, muffled by the boards, with a quality in it she had not heard from him before. Something that was not quite fury and not quite disbelief. That was both of those things together. "Who's up there?" he said. "Eliza Holt," she said to the floor. "Nay, Rowan. You put an eviction notice on my mother's door in Pittsburgh in September of 1878. She was sick in the back room." A silence from below the floor. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had changed. "You rode a gray horse," she said. "You didn't look back." She kept the rifle on the deputy in front of her. "You're going to stay down there, Marshal, until my husband comes through that door and we decide what happens next." The deputy in front of her was looking at her with an expression she recognized because she had seen it before. It was the expression she had seen on the faces of the men in the line in Caldwell when Brennan Holt walked past Caroline Fitch and Ruth Alderman and stopped in front of her. The expression of someone who has made an assumption and discovered it is wrong and does not yet know what to do with that information. She kept the rifle steady and waited for Brennan. He came around the south corner of the cabin, moving carefully, his left arm held close, his rifle in his right hand. He saw her at the window. He saw the deputy with his hands up. He saw the cellar latch in place. He came to the door and looked in at her. She looked back. "Two deputies down on the south side," he said. "Not dead, not going anywhere. The other three are on the ground and staying there." She lowered the rifle slightly. The deputy in front of her hadn't moved. "Voss is in the cellar," she said. Brennan's eyes went to the trap door. He looked at it for a moment. She watched something move through his face. Not triumph, exactly. Nothing so clean as that. Something older and heavier. The face of a man who has been carrying something for 2 years and feels the weight of it shift. He crossed the room and crouched down by the trap door, and the movement cost him something. She could see it cost him, but he made it. He put his hand on the latch. "Voss?" he said. Silence from below. "Caleb Voss," he said again, and his voice was level, the same voice he used for everything, the same voice he had used to tell her about Jesse on a cold night by a fire, absolutely controlled and carrying everything. "You're under citizen's arrest for the murders of Jesse Holt and Frank Alderman and Thomas Carey, and for land fraud and corruption of office, and whatever else the federal authorities decide to add when they see what I've been keeping for 3 years. He paused. "We're going to wait here, all of us, until spring allows for travel, and then you're going to ride down this mountain with us to answer for it." From below the floor, after a long silence, came the voice of Caleb Voss, stripped now of the carrying authority, the easy confidence. Just a man's voice. "You have nothing," he said. Brennan looked at Eliza. She looked at him. "We have everything," Brennan said. "We've had it for 3 years. We were just waiting for you to come close enough." He stood up. He looked at Eliza across the cabin, across the cleared space where the rug had been, across everything that had happened in this room since October, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because the quiet between them had become, over the course of a winter, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. "Get the rope," he said. She set down the kettle, picked up the rope from the nail beside the door, and handed it to him. They had work to do. The rope work took the better part of an hour. Not because it was complicated, but because Brennan was working one-handed, guarding his left side, and because the deputies outside had to be dealt with one at a time, which meant Eliza kept the rifle on them in rotation while he tied each man's wrists with the methodical care of someone who had no intention of doing this twice. She watched him work and did not offer to help because she could see he needed to do it himself, needed the physical doing of it after weeks of lying still and being tended to. Voss came out of the cellar last. She had left the latch in place while they dealt with the others, and from below she could hear him periodically, testing the door. Not frantically, systematically. Which told her something about the man, that even in a cellar, bound by circumstance, if not yet by rope, he was looking for the problem to solve, the angle to work. She kept one part of her attention on the sound of it the whole time. When Brennan finally opened the trapdoor, he stood back and to the right, and she had the rifle positioned, and Voss came up the ladder slowly, because there was nothing else to do. And when he came fully into the light of the cabin, he looked at her first, and then at Brennan, and his face was composed in a way that was worse, somehow, than anger would have been. Composed the way a man is composed when he is telling himself this is not finished, when he is already moving pieces in his head toward whatever comes next. He was a tall man, heavier than she'd have guessed from seeing him on horseback, The badge on his coat was silver and genuine and caught the light, the same way it had caught the light on the street in Pittsburgh, and she hated it with a specific hatred she had not known she was carrying until she saw it up close. "Marshal," Brennan said. Voss looked at him. "You understand this means nothing without a court willing to hear it," he said. "You know who sits on the circuit bench." "I know who sat on it," Brennan said. "I've had 3 years to make sure the federal office in Helena knows it too." Something moved in Voss's face. A calculation disrupted. "You couldn't have gotten word out, not from up here." "Not this winter," Brennan said. "Last spring. When I came down for supplies, before Greer's men started watching the road, I sent a packet to a federal investigator in Helena. 27 pages. Names, dates, property transfers, affidavits from 3 witnesses who'd been afraid to speak on record but put their names to paper when I asked them right." He paused. "They've been sitting on it, waiting for something that would give them enough to move. Something like a territorial marshal riding up a mountain with 5 deputies to silence a witness." Voss was very still. "You did the work for me," Brennan said. "You just had to wait long enough." The composure cracked, just slightly, just at the edges. She saw it, and she thought that this was the thing about men like Voss. They were patient and careful, and they planned well, and when a plan failed comprehensively, they could not fully believe it, could not absorb it cleanly because they had never seriously imagined it as a possibility. "Tie his hands," Brennan said to Eliza, without looking at her. She set down the rifle and picked up the remaining rope and crossed the room and stood in front of Caleb Voss. Up close he smelled of cold and hoarse, and the particular smell of authority that had gone stale. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. She thought about her mother, about a piece of paper flapping in the cold, about 4 weeks of managing a dying woman and a dying business, and a situation that had been arranged to be unwinnable before she ever sat down at the table. She tied his hands. She was not rough about it, and she was not gentle about it. She was thorough about it, the way she was thorough about everything. When she was done, she stepped back. "You were in Pittsburgh," she said, "in the fall of 1878. You put an eviction notice on a property on Garfield Street." He looked at her. "My mother was in the back room," she said. "I want you to know I remember that." He said nothing. "I don't need you to say anything about it," she said. "I'm not telling you to get a response. I'm telling you because I decided a long time ago that if I was ever in front of you again, I was going to say it out loud. So it exists somewhere outside my own head." She looked at him for another moment. "That's all." She turned and went back to the fire and put more wood on it, because the door had been opened too many times and the cabin had gone cold. They kept Voss and the 4 surviving deputies in the cabin for 6 weeks. This was not the arrangement she would have designed, given a choice, but choice had nothing to do with it. The mountain decided, and the mountain had decided on another heavy snow in February that sealed the pass for most of the month and left them all living in enforced proximity in a space that was not designed for 8 people and that tested, daily, the limits of what a person could manage without losing her composure entirely. She cooked for all of them. This was practical, not generous. Someone had to cook, and she was the best at it, and the work gave her something to do with her hands during the long days. She made large batches of the same things she'd been making all winter: beans and salt pork and bread, and whatever came out of the root cellar in the rotation she'd organized in October, and she fed 8 people from a single fire and did not apologize for the plainness of it. The deputies ate without complaint. 2 of them, the younger ones, had the decency to thank her. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Cal, who had a wide, simple face and looked about 23 years old, told her on the 4th day that he hadn't known, fully, what Voss was when he signed on. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "That may be true," and left it there, because she was not in a position to forgive anything on behalf of the people Voss had hurt, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Voss ate and said very little. He watched everything. She kept feeling his eyes on her when she moved around the cabin, a watching that was not threatening, exactly, but was constant. The watching of a man who was still looking for the move he hadn't made yet. She told Brennan about it one night when everyone else was sleeping. "He's calculating," Brennan said. He was sitting up more easily now, the wound healing toward something that would be a significant scar but would not be, as she had feared in the worst nights, the end of him. "He's been calculating since he came up the ladder." "He won't find anything to calculate," she said. "I know," he said, "but knowing that doesn't stop him doing it." She looked across the cabin at the sleeping forms. At Voss, who was nearest the door, Wrist bound to a ring bolt, Brennan had driven into the wall 3 days after the capture, when it became clear that 6 weeks of cohabitation required something more reliable than a man's word. "He's going to argue diminishment," she said, in Helena. "He's going to say the evidence was improperly kept, that the witnesses were coerced, that whatever technicality exists, it exists here." "Yes," Brennan said. "And the circuit judge? The circuit judge is already under federal investigation. By now, if the timing held, he's been suspended." He paused. "I don't know that for certain. I won't know until we get down. But that was the plan, and the federal investigator I corresponded with was a careful man." She held that uncertainty for a moment. The not knowing was the hardest part. It had been the hardest part since October, since the line in Caldwell, since before that, the necessity of acting without being able to see how things would land. "What if it didn't hold?" she said. "What if we get down there and the judge is still in place and Voss walks away from it?" Brennan was quiet. Then we try something else. We go higher, federal circuit in Washington if we have to." He looked at her. "I've been at this for 3 years. I'm not done at the first failure." She looked at him. She thought about the word "we," which he had used without marking it, without making anything of it, as if it were simply a given. She found that the word had weight, a good weight, the kind you feel when you pick something up and it's exactly as solid as it looks. "All right," she said. The snow cleared in the first week of March. She knew it from the quality of the light through the shutters in the morning. A different light, sharper, the blue-white light of winter giving way to something that had yellow in it, something that meant the angle of the sun had shifted. She opened the south-facing shutter and stood with the cold air on her face and looked at the mountain going down, the white of it and the dark of the pine and the sky above that was, for the first time in weeks, a clear, hard blue. Brennan came and stood beside her. They looked at it together. 2 days for the past to firm up enough, he said. "I know," she said. "I want to do something before we go," he said. She looked at him. I was looking at the mountain, not at her, which she had learned was the position he took when he was going to say something that cost him something to say. "I told you, in Caldwell, that I chose you because you were built to last, because you didn't flinch." He paused. That was true, and it wasn't enough of the truth. She waited. "I didn't know, when I said it, what the rest of it was," he said. I'm not someone who knows things like that quickly. It takes me longer than most." He was still looking at the mountain. "But I know now, and I should say it plainly because you deserve plainness. You've been lied to by omission enough by enough people, and I don't want to be one of them." "Brennan," she said quietly, "I married you because I needed someone," he said, "and you have become—" He stopped, tried again. "You have become the person I didn't know I was looking for. Not because you held a rifle steady or sewed me back together or thought of the cellar trap or any of the things that saved us, though all of those things are real, and I don't take one of them lightly. But because you—" He turned and looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her in the line in Caldwell, as if she were a problem worth the effort of really seeing. "Because you are exactly who you are, all the time, without apology. And I had forgotten, in 7 years alone, that a person could be like that. I had forgotten what it felt like to be around it." The air between them was cold and still. She thought about the brown dress, about 12 days of being looked past, about the moment his boots stopped in front of her, and she had looked up not knowing what she would find. She said, "I am not easy to be with." "I know," he said. "Neither am I. I move things where they make sense to me, and I have strong opinions about fireplaces, and I will argue with you when I think you're wrong." "You're right about fireplaces," he said. She almost smiled. The almost smile that she had developed in this cabin, the way you develop things in cold weather, slowly, close to a source of heat. "I'm aware that this started as a transaction," she said. "I'm aware of what you said in Caldwell, and I'm aware of what we signed, and I'm aware that none of it was what people mean when they talk about how things are supposed to begin." "No," he said. "But I'm also aware," she said, "that I have not cared about any of that for a long time. I don't know exactly when it stopped mattering and started being something else." She looked at his face, the scar, and the weathering, and the gray-brown eyes that she knew now as well as she knew her own hands. "But it did." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically. Just took it, The way you take the hand of someone you've decided you're standing next to for good. She let him hold it. They stood at the shutter and looked at the mountain going white and blue into the March sky and held on to each other in the plain way of two people who have been through something real together and have come out the other side still standing, and neither of them said anything more because there was nothing more that needed to be said right then. The ride down took most of 2 days. She had imagined it, over the winter, as a kind of release, the moment of descent, the mountain behind them, the world opening up. The reality was harder than the imagination. The trail was treacherous with late winter ice in the shadowed sections. 2 of the deputies had to be watched constantly. Voss rode in the middle of the column, wrists bound to his saddle horn, and he rode with a dignity that she found more troubling than rage would have been, the dignity of a man who has not yet accepted that his story has ended. Brennan rode at the front with his left arm still guarded, and she rode behind Voss and kept her eyes moving the way he had taught her, and the mountain came down around them in stages, the tree line thickening as they descended, the air warming by fractions, the sound of running water beginning to appear beneath the ice of the creek crossings. They reached Caldwell on the afternoon of the second day. She had expected to feel something specific when she saw the town again. She had left it in October as a woman who had run out of other options, who had gotten into a wagon with a stranger because the alternative was standing in line indefinitely being invisible. She had thought, riding back, that she would feel the difference keenly, would feel it as a kind of arrival. What she actually felt was tired and alert and watchful, which was what she had been feeling for 4 months, and underneath that something quieter, something that had to do with knowing who she was in this place, in a way she hadn't known in October. The town noticed them before they reached the main street. It was the column that did it. 8 riders, 2 of them known to be Brennan Holt and a woman who was presumably his wife, and the rest of them clearly under some kind of constraint. People came to doorways. A man working at the livery stopped and stared. A woman hanging washing on a line at the side of a house held the sheet she was holding and watched them pass. Mrs. Dorothy Crane was on the boardwalk outside the territorial office. Eliza met her eyes as they rode past. Mrs. Crane looked at her, at the rifle across her lap, at her coat worn and weather-beaten from a winter of hard use, at the straight way she sat the horse, and then looked at Voss with his bound wrists and his badge, and her expression went through several things in rapid succession, ending somewhere that was not quite respect but was its near neighbor. Eliza nodded once. Mrs. Crane nodded back. The federal deputy marshal was already in Caldwell. Brennan had been right about the timing. The man in Helena had moved, and the circuit judge had been suspended, and there were 2 federal investigators who had been waiting in the nearest available town for the mountain to open up and the situation to resolve one way or the other. They met the column at the edge of the main street, and Eliza watched the transfer of Voss and his deputies, watched the tin box of records change hands, watched Brennan talk to the federal men with the careful, precise speech of someone who had been holding information in organized form for 3 years and knew exactly how to give it over. It took 3 hours. She sat on a bench outside the land office and drank the coffee someone brought her. She never found out who, a woman from inside the office, who had set it beside her without ceremony and gone back in. And she watched the street and let herself breathe in a way she hadn't breathed since October. The man named Cal, the young deputy with the wide face, was sitting on a separate bench 15 feet away, waiting to give his account. He caught her eye once. He looked like he wanted to say something and didn't know how. "It's all right," she said. He looked surprised that she'd spoken to him. "I want you to know," he started. "I know," she said. "Just tell them the truth about everything you saw. That's all you can do now." He nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." She drank her coffee. Brennan came out of the land office 2 hours later and sat beside her on the bench. He was moving better than he had been at the start of the ride down, which she took as a sign that the descent had not torn anything, which had been her primary worry. "It's done," he said. "What happens now?" "Voss goes to federal custody in Helena for arraignment. The other men," he paused, "some of them will testify against him in exchange for consideration, Cal in particular. He knows a lot about the syndicate operations, and he's willing to talk." He looked out at the street. "The land company that recorded the fraudulent transfers is already under investigation. The 5 ranchers Voss pushed out, 2 of them are still alive in other territories. The federal office will try to contact them." She thought about the 5 ranchers, about the 2 who were dead, about Jesse Holt on a trap line in August. And the water rights? Still ours, he said. Clear title. The investigation doesn't touch them. She looked at the street, at the people on it who had been going about their lives all winter while she and Brennan were on the mountain doing what they had done. She thought about how most of what happens in the world happens that way, in out-of-the-way places, by people nobody is watching, and the world goes on around it entirely unaware until it's already been decided. There's something I want to do, she said. He waited. I want to file a complaint, she said. On the record. About the eviction notice in Pittsburgh. About my mother. He was quiet a moment. It won't bring charges. It's outside the federal jurisdiction here. I know, she said. I don't care about charges. I care about it being on the record somewhere, officially, with a name and a date. She paused. So that when they list what Caleb Voss did, her name is in it. Margaret Rowan. She is in it. He looked at her. Then we'll file it, he said. They went back inside and she told the federal investigator what she needed, and he wrote it down in his ledger with a pen that scratched on the paper, and he said her mother's name aloud when he wrote it, the way people do when they're making sure they have the spelling right, and that was enough. It was not justice. It was not what her mother deserved, but it was her mother's name in a federal ledger, in connection with the name of the man who had helped kill her, and that was something. And Eliza decided to let it be enough because the alternative was to chase a feeling that would never fully arrive, and she had work to do. They stayed in Caldwell for 3 days, dealing with the formal requirements: statements, signed accounts, the transfer of the evidence package, a meeting with a land attorney who confirmed in writing the status of the water rights, and filed a copy of that confirmation with the federal office so that there were now records in 3 separate locations, which was what Brennan had wanted and had been working toward for 3 years. On the second evening, Mrs. Crane invited them to supper. Eliza accepted before Brennan could find a reason not to, because she thought he needed to eat a meal in a normal room with people around, and because she needed it too, and because there was a kind of stubborn dignity in returning to the place where things had started and sitting down to eat at a table without apology. Mrs. Crane had cooked a serious meal: roasted chicken, potatoes, preserved green beans from the cellar, bread that was adequate if not impressive. She served it without ceremony, and she asked direct questions about the winter and the mountain and what had happened, and Eliza answered them directly, and partway through the meal she noticed that Mrs. Crane had stopped looking at her with the expression she had worn in October, the one that was not unkind but was resigned, the expression of someone who has stopped expecting much, and had started looking at her with something that was simply attention. Interest. The look you give someone when you are finding out that they are more than you had assumed. Eliza thought about what it had cost her to be underestimated all her life, by all the people who had done it, and what it might be worth to change one person's assessment. She decided it was worth something, though not everything. Not the thing she'd needed it to be in October, when she'd been standing in that line. It turned out the thing she'd needed in October was not other people's changed opinions, but her own, and she had changed that opinion herself over a winter that had nothing to do with anyone in this room. On the 3rd day, Brennan found her outside behind the rooming house, looking north at the mountains. "Ready to go back up?" he said. She had been thinking about that, about what it meant to go back up, to return to the cabin after everything that had happened in it. She had been thinking about whether she could look at the floor without seeing the trapdoor, whether she could look at the fireplace without seeing Brennan on the floor beside it with his hand pressed to his side, whether the cabin had been shaped too much by that winter to be what it needed to be, which was a place to live. She had decided that it could be, that she could make it so. She was good at making things from scratch, and she was good at making things from what she had. And what she had was a solid cabin in a good position on a mountain with clean water, and a man she had married for the wrong reasons at the right time, and that was more than she had walked into Caldwell with in October. "Yes," she said. He stood beside her looking at the mountains. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. He looked directly at her the way he had looked at her in the clearing and from across tables and through firelight for the length of a winter, the way she had gotten used to and would miss if she didn't have it. "I want to ask you to be my wife," he said, "not the way it was before, not because I needed someone who could survive and you were the practical choice." He paused. "Because I want you there. Specifically, you. For whatever comes next." She looked at his face, the scar and the weathering and the gray-brown eyes and the mouth that almost smiled sometimes. The man who had written 27 pages of careful records and hidden them and lived alone with the weight of his dead brother for 2 years, and chosen her with more honesty than she had ever been chosen with before, even if the honesty was blunt and the reasoning was imperfect. Nobody was perfect. That was the thing about it, the thing she had been figuring out over a winter of imperfect stitches and an imperfect fireplace, and two imperfect people getting it wrong in small ways and right in the ways that mattered. You didn't wait for a perfect beginning or a perfect moment or a perfect man. You worked with what was true, and you made something out of it. And if you were stubborn enough and honest enough and willing enough to do the hard parts without looking for an exit, sometimes what you made was better than anything you had planned for. Yes, she said. Same answer as October. Better reasons. He looked at her for a moment. Then the thing that was almost a smile happened, and this time it went all the way. And she saw what his real smile looked like for the first time in 5 months. And it was worth the wait. They rode back up the mountain on a morning in mid-March, when the sky was the particular blue of early spring at elevation, and the snow was soft at the edges, and the creek crossings ran with cold, clear water that caught the light and threw it back. She did not look at the cabin differently when they arrived. She had decided that on the way up. She got down from the horse and tied it, and opened the door and went inside and built the fire from the coals they had banked before leaving, and the cabin warmed, and she opened the south-facing shutter and let the light in. Brennan came in behind her and stood in the middle of the room and looked around at the space they had made, the two of them, over a winter, without planning to, out of necessity and habit and proximity, and eventually something that was not any of those things. I need to fix the north wall chinking again, she said. The freeze-thaw cracked some of it. I saw, he said. I can do the upper sections. Your side is healing, he said. Let me do the upper sections. She looked at him. Fine, she said. Do the upper sections. He sat down at the table. She sat down across from him. The fire talked between them. Outside, the snow was melting off the south-facing slope, and the creek was running, and somewhere up in the high pines a bird was doing the thing birds do in March, when they feel the season turning, calling out to no one in particular, just calling. She thought about her mother, who had thought she would run a restaurant someday. Something bigger than the bakery. She thought that maybe her mother hadn't been wrong, exactly, just imprecise about the shape of it. It didn't have to be a restaurant. It could be a mountain and a set of water rights, and a man who had chosen her for her endurance and had kept choosing her for reasons that got better the longer they knew each other. She thought about the things that people look past when they decide too fast what something is worth, the things they don't bother to look at, the woman in the brown dress at the end of the line, the cracked water barrel in the corner of a cabin, the piece of paper behind a hearthstone that contained everything. She had learned something over that winter that she would spend the rest of her life knowing in different ways and different depths, that the things built for survival, the practical things, the unglamorous things, the things assembled under duress without any guarantee they would hold, are sometimes the strongest things there are. That a marriage begun for the wrong reasons by two people honest enough to see each other clearly can become something the stories don't usually bother to tell, because it doesn't fit the shape they've decided love has to take. It doesn't look like what they put in the stories. It looks like a lantern on the left side of the table. It looks like 12 stitches that aren't pretty, but hold. It looks like a man sleeping on his own floor for 3 weeks because there wasn't another arrangement. And then one day there was, and neither of them said much about the change because some things you just live into rather than announce. It looks like two people sitting at a table in a mountain cabin in March, with a fire going and the snow melting off the south face and everything terrible behind them and everything ordinary ahead of them, and finding that the ordinary is enough, is more than enough, is exactly what they'd been building toward through all the rest of it. What do you want to do first? Brennan asked. She looked around the cabin, the north wall, the root cellar, which needed restocking after the winter, the cellar trap door, which she had already decided she was going to replace with a heavier door and a better latch, because even though Voss was gone and the syndicate was dismantled, she was not going to be a woman who left the weak points weak out of optimism. North wall, she said, before the warm weather makes us forget it's there. He nodded. He got up and went for the chinking material. She put on her coat and went out to start on the lower sections. The mountain was quiet around them, the way it was quiet on a morning in early spring when the winter has just let go, and the world is settling into a new weight, lighter, the air carrying something it hadn't carried in months. She worked with her hands in the cold, filling the gaps in the logs, pressing the material in tight and even, and she could hear Brennan on the upper sections above her, and the sound of the two of them working on the same wall from different heights was not a dramatic sound, not the sound of anything a story would usually stop to record. But it was real. It was solid. It was exactly what it looked like, and it would hold. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had just needed a winter and a mountain, and a man who looked at her hands and told the truth to understand it. She kept working, and the morning light came down through the pines and lay across the cabin wall in long, bright strips. And somewhere above her, Brennan was doing the upper sections, and the creek ran below them both, clean and cold and continuous, the way water runs when it knows exactly where it belongs.